Imagine an empire so vast, so terrifyingly efficient, that it conquered more land in 25 years than the Romans did in 400. This isn't just history. It's a blueprint for total war, forged by nomadic horsemen who redefined what it meant to fight. For centuries, military power was synonymous with fortified cities, advanced siegecraft, and the disciplined legions of settled civilizations. But how could a dispersed collection of tribes, without urban centers or even a unified written language for much of its early existence, rise to become the greatest contiguous empire the world has ever known? Their enemies were not tribal skirmishers but powerful, established empires. The sophisticated Song dynasty of China, the mighty Khwarezmian Empire, the formidable armies of Eastern Europe. They possessed grand capitals, sophisticated metallurgy, and logistical networks that dwarfed anything the Mongols started with. Yet they crumbled. But think about this. The Mongols possessed an unyielding advantage, born not from steel and stone, but from a relentless spirit, unparalleled horsemanship, and a tactical brilliance that bordered on the prescient. They were the ultimate adaptive predator, transforming every disadvantage into a weapon. It was revolutionary. They refined their fighting into an art form that combined speed, deception, and overwhelming psychological terror. We're talking about tactics that shattered empires, not just armies. Their campaigns were not mere raids. They were catastrophic waves of destruction that swept away entire civilizations, then built new systems of control from the ashes. Here's a chilling detail. Many Mongol generals, like Subutai or Jebe, were illiterate, yet their strategic genius and coordination across vast distances remain unparalleled in military history. They operated like a perfectly synchronized organism, a distributed network of destructive force where every warrior, every rider, understood their role in the grand design. This wasn't brute force. Before the thunder of their hooves echoed across continents, the Mongols were a disparate collection of warring tribes. What single, brutal innovation turned these fractious nomads into the most disciplined, unified, and terrifying army the world had ever seen? To understand this transformation, we must first glimpse the chaotic landscape from which it emerged. For centuries, the vast, unforgiving steppes of Central Asia were a crucible of endless skirmishes, petty rivalries, and blood feuds. Clan fought clan, tribe raided tribe, their nomadic existence defined by a brutal cycle of vengeance and survival. Life was cheap, alliances fleeting, and the very concept of a unified identity seemed an impossible dream. But think about this. A people so divided, yet possessing an inherent martial prowess honed by generations of harsh living. It was into this volatile world that Temujin was born around 1162. His early life was not one of privilege but of brutal hardship, a crucible that would forge his ruthless resolve. Abandoned, hunted, enslaved, he experienced firsthand the treachery and disunity that plagued his people. His father's murder by a rival tribe plunged his family into destitution, forcing them to survive on roots and rodents. This was not merely adversity. It was an education in the raw mechanics of power, betrayal, and the desperate need for solidarity. He learned that survival, let alone supremacy, demanded absolute loyalty and unflinching discipline. This painful genesis informed his radical vision. Upon unifying the disparate Mongol tribes, Temujin, now known as Genghis Khan, didn't just conquer them, he fundamentally rebuilt them. His most audacious, most brutal innovation was the systematic dismantling of the ancient tribal order, replacing it with a ruthless meritocracy. Can you imagine the sheer audacity of this? In a society where lineage and family ties had always been paramount, Genghis decreed that a man's worth was no longer determined by his birthright, but by his loyalty, skill, and courage in battle. This was a direct assault on the very foundations of every existing power structure. Commanders were appointed not because they were the eldest son of a tribal chief, but because they had proven themselves under fire. Warriors from vanquished tribes were integrated directly into the Mongol ranks, often under the command of their former enemies, if those enemies showed greater ability. This radical shift didn't just break the cycle of intertribal warfare. It forged a new, unified Mongol identity where allegiance was to the Khan and the state, not to a fading clan banner. But how do you structure an army born from such diverse origins? The answer lay in the revolutionary decimal system of military organization. Genghis Khan meticulously reorganized every Mongol male capable of fighting into units of 10 Arbans, 100 Jaguns, 1,000 Minghans, and 10,000 Tumans. This wasn't merely a counting system. It was a complete societal overhaul, ensuring that loyalties were fragmented away from old tribal affiliations and cemented into these new, functional military units. Every man, from the humblest shepherd to the most seasoned warrior, knew his place within this meticulously ordered machine. A Tuman, a unit of 10,000 men, was a self-contained, multifunctional fighting force, capable of independent operations for extended periods. This allowed for unparalleled strategic flexibility and speed. This new structure was underpinned by a chillingly severe discipline, enforced by the unyielding strictures of the Yasa, Genghis Khan's written code of law. Disobedience was not merely punished. It was often met with death. If a soldier fled in battle, not only was he executed, but often his entire Arban, his unit of 10, faced the same fate. If an Arban retreated without orders, its Jagan of 100 might be obliterated. This wasn't just discipline. It was a psychological weapon, ensuring that every soldier's survival was tied to the unwavering courage and steadfastness of his comrades. Think about the pressure this instilled. Every man became a disciplinarian for the 9 others beside him. Such extreme measures forged an army with an unbreakable fighting spirit and an almost supernatural cohesion. They moved as one, fought as one, and survived as one. Their inherent equestrian culture, which had always defined their nomadic life, was now meticulously refined into an unparalleled military advantage. Every Mongol warrior was a superb horseman, often riding multiple ponies on campaign, allowing for incredible speed and endurance. They could cover vast distances faster than any army before them, often appearing as if from nowhere, striking with devastating force before vanishing again. This fluid, terrifying mobility was their signature. Their composite bows, deadly accurate from horseback, could pierce armor at range, unleashing a storm of arrows before closing in for the kill. They practiced intricate maneuvers, perfected the feigned retreat, luring enemies into traps with chilling precision. Could any traditional infantry formation stand against such fluid terror, a human wave that could materialize and disappear at will? Their tactical genius was not just in their weapons, but in their absolute mastery of movement and psychological warfare. Furthermore, the Mongol war machine was almost entirely self-sufficient. Unlike the cumbersome armies of settled empires, burdened by vast supply trains, the Mongols traveled light. Each warrior carried his own provisions, often dried meat and fermented mare's milk, and lived off the land and their herds when necessary. Their horses were not just transport. They were a moving larder, providing sustenance in desperate times. This incredible self-reliance meant they were not constrained by traditional logistics, allowing them to penetrate deep into enemy territory and sustain campaigns for years on end, far from any established base. Forget the quartermaster. These men were their own supply chain. This self-sufficiency was honed through relentless training that blurred the lines between peacetime activity and war. The massive annual hunts, known as Nurj, were not merely sport. They were grand military exercises. Thousands of men would fan out in a vast circle, driving all game before them, practicing their cavalry tactics, communication, and coordination on a grand scale. This constant, high-stakes practice cultivated an endurance and battlefield awareness unrivaled by any contemporary army. They weren't just practicing. They were living warfare, ensuring that when true battle arrived, it felt like just another, albeit deadlier, hunt. Genghis Khan's genius lay not in inventing these elements individually, but in weaving them together into a terrifyingly efficient, adaptable, and unified whole. He took a disorganized collection of fierce but fractious tribes and, through brutal reforms and strategic foresight, forged them into an indomitable fighting force. From the absolute loyalty fostered by meritocracy, to the precision of the decimal system, to the iron will imposed by harsh discipline, every reform was a critical gear in the genesis of the Mongol war machine. This wasn't just a new army. It was a new way of waging war, a revolutionary paradigm shift that would shatter the empires and reshape the map of the known world. The thunder of their hooves was about to echo across continents, and the world was utterly unprepared for the storm that Genghis Khan had unleashed. What if you could win a war before a single arrow was fired? The Mongols perfected this dark art, turning whispers into screams and fear into absolute paralysis, proving that the mind could be a more potent weapon than any blade. This wasn't merely a byproduct of their conquests. It was a meticulously cultivated strategy, a calculated algorithm of dread designed to fracture enemy will before a single clash of steel. Consider, for a moment, the sheer audacity of this approach. To weaponize rumor, to transmute battlefield brutality into a psychological force so overwhelming that entire cities surrendered or fled at the mere mention of your approach. The Mongols understood the fundamental truth that war is as much a psychological struggle as it is a physical one. Their reputation for unparalleled ruthlessness became their most devastating vanguard, preceding their armies like a phantom plague. But how was such a terrifying legend forged? It began with examples so stark, so utterly brutal, that they burned themselves into the collective consciousness of nations. The destruction of cities like Merv and Nishapur stands as a horrifying testament to this. Merv, once the jewel of the Islamic world, a city of 1 million souls and countless treasures, became a chilling object lesson. When it resisted the Mongol horde in 1221, the consequences were apocalyptic. Contemporary accounts, while perhaps inflated to amplify the horror, speak of nearly 1.7 million people systematically slaughtered, their bodies piled high enough to form small mountains, every building razed to the ground. Can you imagine the sheer, unfathomable terror of witnessing such an act? It wasn't just mass murder. It was an act of strategic dehumanization, a stark demonstration that the Mongols were not merely invaders, but an existential force of annihilation. Nishapur met a similar, equally gruesome fate. After its resistance resulted in the death of Talyui, Genghis Khan's son-in-law, the Mongol response was orchestrated by his widow, a chilling example of strategic vengeance. Every living creature, from dogs and cats to men, women, and children, was ordered to be killed. Not only that, but a pyramid of severed heads was constructed outside the city walls, a grotesque monument to Mongol retribution. The message was unequivocally clear. Resistance meant oblivion, a fate so total that not even the memory of the city would remain untainted by horror. This wasn't random savagery. It was a carefully curated propaganda campaign executed with horrifying precision. This system of terror formed the bedrock of their surrender or die policy. When the Mongols approached a city, an ultimatum would be issued. Capitulate immediately, open your gates, offer tribute, and accept Mongol rule, or face utter destruction. Those who chose to resist, those who dared to defy the burgeoning empire, were shown no quarter. Their cities were annihilated, their populations massacred or enslaved, their infrastructure razed, leaving only desolation. But think about the other side of this chilling coin. Cities that surrendered were often spared. Their populations were absorbed, their craftsmen and engineers pressed into service for the Mongol war machine, their leaders sometimes even maintained as vassals. This stark binary choice created an irresistible psychological pressure. It wasn't about negotiation. It was about survival. To make this policy truly effective, the Mongols needed accurate, timely intelligence. Their spy network was legendary, a sophisticated web woven across continents. They employed Karalas, scouts and spies, who infiltrated enemy territories months, sometimes years, in advance. These operatives gathered critical data: the strength of garrisons, the political stability of rulers, the presence of internal dissent, the availability of resources, even the layout of city defenses. But this intelligence was not merely for military planning. It was also the fuel for their psychological warfare machine. Consider this: information in the right hands is power. The Mongols used their intelligence to sow discord and panic. They would spread rumors of their invincibility, exaggerate their numbers, or reveal embarrassing truths about local rulers to undermine authority. They exploited existing ethnic and religious tensions, fostering internal strife within enemy states. A kingdom already teetering on the brink of civil war would find itself pushed over the edge by Mongol agents whispering promises of support to various factions, only to betray them all later. This preemptive destabilization made conquest exponentially easier, turning enemies inward against themselves. Their psychological manipulation extended to the battlefield itself, blurring the lines between military tactic and mind game. The infamous feigned retreat was a masterclass in this. Mongol forces would engage, then suddenly turn and flee, luring undisciplined enemy cavalry into a chaotic, headlong pursuit. But this was no true retreat. It was a perfectly executed ambush, leading their pursuers directly into the waiting arrows and lances of hidden Mongol reserves. Can you imagine the sudden, horrifying realization of being entrapped, caught in a deadly vice after believing victory was at hand? It shattered morale and sowed deep distrust among enemy commanders. Beyond feigned retreats, their methods were designed for perpetual unease. Night attacks, surprise raids on supply lines, and the deliberate speed of their campaigns deprived enemies of sleep, rest, and any sense of security. They moved faster than any army before them, often covering distances in days that other forces took weeks to traverse. This relentless pace created a pervasive sense of helplessness and exhaustion. Commanders would wake to find Mongol forces where they shouldn't possibly be, their siege engines assembled seemingly overnight. This wasn't just military efficiency. It was psychological assault by rapid transit. The ultimate testament to the Mongols' mastery of psychological warfare lies in the historical record of enemy populations fleeing in sheer terror at the mere mention of their approach. The Khwarezmian Empire, a formidable power in its own right, crumbled not just from military defeat but from internal divisions exacerbated by Mongol intelligence and the paralyzing fear of their reputation. Entire cities were evacuated, their inhabitants abandoning homes and livelihoods rather than face the Mongol horde. In Europe, when news of the Mongol advance reached the disparate Rus principalities, chroniclers speak of widespread panic. Many cities were abandoned, their inhabitants seeking refuge in forests or less threatened territories. This fear, this shadow of dread, became their most devastating vanguard. It meant that by the time the actual Mongol army arrived, the enemy was already half defeated. Their will to fight was eroded. Their leaders might be at odds, their populations demoralized or dispersed. The cost of conquest was drastically reduced because the Mongols had already won the battle for the enemy's mind. They didn't just conquer lands. They conquered the human spirit itself, reducing defiant nations to quivering masses of fear. It was a dark, brilliant strategy, proving that the most potent weapon in war is not necessarily the one that sheds the most blood, but the one that utterly breaks the will. And that, fundamentally, is how the Mongols changed warfare forever. They were nomadic horsemen, not engineers. Yet, the Mongols conquered fortified cities thought impregnable, not through brute force alone, but by a chilling genius for adaptation. How did these barbarians become the most sophisticated siege masters of their age? This question dismantles a pervasive myth, a misconception often perpetuated by those who underestimate the sheer intellectual dexterity of the Mongol war machine. To truly grasp their power, we must first unlearn the simplistic narrative of steppe warriors lacking the strategic depth for sustained siege warfare. Consider the prevailing image: swift cavalry, horse archers, a blur across the plains. But what happens when that blur hits an immovable object, a towering wall of stone? The Mongols didn't merely adapt. They absorbed, integrated, and then innovated with a ruthless efficiency that borders on terrifying. They were not stonemasons by birth, nor metallurgists by tradition, but they understood the ultimate weapon: knowledge. Picture a vast, continent-spanning intelligence network, where the spoils of war weren't just gold and slaves, but human expertise. From the moment they encountered the highly sophisticated fortifications of Song China, the Mongols didn't despair. They acquired. They didn't merely defeat their enemies. They conscripted their intellect. Chinese engineers, with centuries of experience in constructing and defending immense cities, suddenly found themselves on the payroll of a new, formidable master. Was this forced collaboration? Absolutely. But the results were undeniable. a fusion of strategic brilliance and pragmatic execution. Imagine the shock of a Chinese general, facing the very siege engines he'd helped perfect, now turned against his own people. The assimilation wasn't limited to the east. As the Mongol hordes swept westward, they encountered the advanced engineering of the Islamic world, a civilization at the zenith of its scientific and architectural prowess. Here, they found new designs for siege engines, improved ballistic calculations, and even the terrifying prospect of early chemical warfare through incendiary projectiles like naphtha. It was a global talent acquisition program, conducted at sword point, unparalleled in human history. They were the ultimate appropriators, turning every conquered culture into a resource pool for their insatiable military ambition. Let's delve into the mechanics. The Mongols deployed trebuchets of staggering scale and power, not the flimsy catapults depicted in pulp fiction. These were precision instruments, capable of hurling massive stones, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds, with devastating force, designed to systematically pulverize even the thickest curtain walls. But think about this. How do you transport an artillery park designed to demolish cities across thousands of miles of rugged terrain? The answer lies in their logistical genius, a facet of Mongol warfare often overlooked. These behemoths were not moved whole. They were meticulously disassembled into component parts. Timber beams, counterweights, ropes, and projectile baskets were carefully numbered, catalogued, and loaded onto vast convoys of wagons and pack animals. It was like a colossal ancient Lego set, each piece destined for a predetermined point on a future battlefield. This wasn't merely practical. It represented an organizational mastery that rivaled any modern military. Upon arrival at a besieged city, these components were reassembled with astonishing speed and precision, often within days. Imagine hundreds of laborers, supervised by captured engineers, constructing a small forest of deadly machinery before the horrified eyes of the city's defenders. This rapid deployment had a profound psychological impact, suggesting an endless, inexhaustible supply of destructive power. They weren't just building weapons, they were building terror itself. Their siege tactics extended far beyond simply flinging rocks. The Mongols manipulated the very environment around a city. Consider their approach to riverine defenses. They didn't just cross rivers, they diverted them. At times, entire waterways were rerouted to expose weaker sections of a city's defenses, or to deny the defenders access to water. This wasn't just engineering. It was a godlike assertion of control over nature itself, turning the landscape into an accomplice in their conquests. Temporary bridges, often constructed with astonishing rapidity, allowed them to traverse moats and waterways with heavy equipment, enabling direct assaults. These weren't crude pontoons. They were often elaborate timber structures, built to support the weight of troops, siege engines, and the continuous flow of supplies. The sheer scale of labor required for such projects, often performed under enemy fire, speaks volumes about the Mongol leadership's ability to drive vast workforces. And what of those workforces? This brings us to one of the most chilling aspects of Mongol siegecraft: the deployment of prisoners of war. Conquered populations weren't just plundered, they were weaponized. Captured soldiers and civilians were forced into labor battalions, compelled to dig trenches, construct earthen ramps, and even push siege towers forward. A significant portion of these laborers were deployed as human shields, forced to advance ahead of the Mongol assault waves, absorbing arrow fire and projectiles from their former compatriots. It was a macabre strategy, a dehumanizing calculation that simultaneously saved Mongol lives and broke the will of the defenders. Can you imagine the moral quandary of defenders firing upon their own countrymen? This psychological warfare was as devastating as any physical assault. Before a single stone flew, Mongol envoys often delivered ultimatums: surrender or face utter annihilation. The brutal reputation of the Mongols, carefully cultivated through systematic destruction in previous conquests, preceded them like a storm cloud. Fear was their most potent weapon, often forcing capitulation before the full weight of their engineering might was even brought to bear. Let's examine specific examples of this terrifying genius. The Siege of Baghdad in 1258 stands as a stark testament to Mongol logistical and engineering prowess. Baghdad was no ordinary city. It was the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, the intellectual and cultural heart of the Islamic world, a metropolis fortified with formidable walls built over centuries. When Hulagu Khan's army, a force estimated at 150,000 to 200,000 men, descended upon it, they brought with them a veritable forest of siege engines. Persian accounts describe hundreds of catapults and trebuchets, many operated by Chinese engineers, raining down stones, flaming naphtha pots, and even disease-ridden corpses onto the city. The sheer number of projectiles, fired relentlessly day and night, transformed the once pristine city into a landscape of rubble and fire. The Mongols didn't just pepper the walls. They conducted a systematic bombardment, focusing on specific sections until they crumbled. Imagine the noise, the dust, the constant terror. It took just 2 weeks for the impregnable city to fall, a speed that astounded contemporaries and sent shockwaves across Eurasia. The destruction that followed was legendary, but the siege itself was a masterclass in engineered annihilation. Even more formidable was the Siege of Xiangyang, a pivotal struggle that opened the path for the final Mongol conquest of the southern Song dynasty. Xiangyang was arguably the most heavily fortified city in the world at the time, a twin city, Xiangyang and Fanqing, situated on opposite banks of the Han River, protected by massive double walls, deep moats, and a formidable naval presence. This was not a quick victory. This siege lasted for an astonishing 5 years, from 1268 to 1273. It was a war of attrition and innovation on a scale rarely seen. Even more formidable was the Siege of Xiangyang, a pivotal struggle that opened the path for the final Mongol conquest of the southern Song dynasty. Xiangyang was arguably the most heavily fortified city in the world at the time, a twin city, Xiangyang and Fanqing, situated on opposite banks of the Han River, protected by massive double walls, deep moats, and a formidable naval presence. This was not a quick victory. This siege lasted for an astonishing 5 years, from 1268 to 1273. It was a war of attrition and innovation on a scale rarely seen. For years, the Mongols found themselves frustrated by Xiangyang's defenses. Their traditional trebuchets, powerful as they were, struggled against the colossal, deep-layered walls. The stalemate demanded a new level of ingenuity, and so, the Mongols once again turned to their acquired expertise. From Persia, they brought in engineers who introduced the Hui Pao or Islamic trebuchet. This was no minor upgrade. It was a revolution. Unlike the tension-powered traction trebuchets, the Islamic trebuchet utilized a massive counterweight, offering vastly superior power and precision. These machines could hurl stones weighing up to 200 to 300 pounds over half a mile with incredible accuracy. The deployment of these new superweapons at Xiangyang was a game-changer. Persian engineers, now working for the Mongols, meticulously constructed several of these massive engines. The impact was immediate and devastating. One chronicler recounts a single stone from a Hui Pao smashing through the walls of Fanqing, causing the entire tower to collapse and killing hundreds. The sheer force was beyond anything the Chinese defenders had ever witnessed. This wasn't just an engineering feat. It was an act of psychological warfare, signaling the end of the Song's ability to resist. The fall of Fanqing, under the relentless barrage of these new trebuchets, demoralized the defenders of Xiangyang beyond recovery. The subsequent surrender of Xiangyang was a direct consequence of the Mongols' unparalleled ability to identify, assimilate, and strategically deploy the most advanced military technology available from across their vast empire. They weren't just besieging a city. They were conducting a multi-year, multicultural engineering project, turning foreign genius into a tool of conquest. So, the next time you hear Mongol, don't just picture a horse archer on an open steppe. Picture an empire that could construct colossal siege engines, divert rivers, build bridges, and weaponize entire populations with chilling efficiency. Their mastery of siege warfare, born from an insatiable appetite for knowledge and an unparalleled capacity for adaptation, wasn't just a tactic. It was a fundamental pillar of the Mongol war machine. It transformed them from nomadic raiders into the architects of the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen, proving that true power isn't just about what you invent, but what you are willing to learn and ruthlessly apply. This assimilation of genius, this terrifying ability to turn any strategic challenge into an opportunity for devastating innovation, forever changed the face of warfare. The Mongol tide eventually receded, but its impact reverberated for centuries, irrevocably altering the map of the world and the very definition of warfare. Did their barbaric tactics inadvertently lay the groundwork for a more connected, and perhaps even modern, world? The answer, as with most grand historical narratives, is complex, woven from threads of unparalleled destruction and astonishing, albeit unintended, advancement. For generations after their Golden Horde began to fragment, the shadow of the Mongol war machine stretched long across Eurasia, compelling every subsequent military leader to confront its legacy, whether in awe or in terror. Think about the sheer psychological impact. An army that seemed invincible, sweeping across continents with a speed and ferocity never before witnessed. How do you prepare for such a force, let alone defeat it? The states bordering the Mongol Empire, from the Mamluks of Egypt to the nascent powers of Europe, were forced to adapt or perish. The Mamluks, initially Turkic slave soldiers, stand as a pivotal example. They were the first major power to decisively halt the Mongol advance at Ain Jalut in 1260. A victory that shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility and sent shockwaves through the known world. But here's the twist. The Mamluks didn't just repel the Mongols. They learned from them. They observed the devastating effectiveness of light cavalry, the coordinated feigned retreats, the mastery of the composite bow, and the disciplined command structure that defined the Mongol forces. Can you imagine studying the very tactics that nearly annihilated you? They integrated these lessons, transforming their own military into a more agile and formidable force, capable of defending their empire for another 250 years. Across the Mediterranean, European powers, initially spared the full brunt of the Mongol onslaught due to internal succession crises within the Great Khanate, still felt the tremor. Their response was a mix of terrified apprehension and grudging admiration. While European feudal armies, with their heavily armored knights and slow-moving infantry, were ill-equipped to face the Mongol hordes head-on, the lessons of speed, maneuverability, and logistics began to subtly seep into their military thinking. Remember the era of medieval siege warfare, often prolonged and costly? The Mongols perfected siegecraft, employing engineers from conquered territories, utilizing trebuchets and even early forms of gunpowder weapons with devastating efficiency. This brutal pragmatism, where the most effective tools were adopted regardless of origin, was a stark contrast to European military conservatism. Fast forward centuries, and the ghost of the Mongol war machine can be seen influencing the great gunpowder empires that rose in its wake. The Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Moguls. These empires, spanning vast geographies, inherited and adapted the Mongols' administrative innovations, their emphasis on a centralized command, and even elements of their cavalry-centric warfare, even as gunpowder artillery began to dominate battlefields. The Ottoman Janissaries, an elite infantry unit directly loyal to the Sultan, echoed the Mongol meritocracy and discipline training, creating a professional army far removed from feudal levies. The Moguls, descendants of Timur, who himself was a self-proclaimed heir to Genghis Khan's legacy, fused Turkic-Mongol military traditions with Indian ingenuity, forging an empire that stretched across the subcontinent. Is it possible that the Mongols' vision of a continent-spanning, centrally controlled state, however violently imposed, provided a conceptual template for future imperial ambitions? But the legacy of the Mongols extends far beyond the battlefield. Paradoxically, out of unimaginable destruction, a period of unprecedented global interconnectedness emerged. The Pax Mongolica. Imagine a vast swath of Eurasia, from the Black Sea to the Pacific, brought under a single, albeit iron-fisted, dominion. What followed was a relative peace within the empire's borders, allowing trade routes like the legendary Silk Road to flourish anew, secure from the myriad petty banditries that had plagued them for centuries. Caravans laden with silk, spices, ceramics, and precious metals now moved with astonishing speed and safety, protected by Mongol garrisons. This wasn't a peace born of benevolence, but a byproduct of absolute control. The alternative was swift, brutal annihilation. This newfound security facilitated an explosion of cultural and technological exchange on a scale that dwarfed any previous era. Think of Marco Polo, whose epic journey to the court of Kublai Khan would have been unthinkable without the stability provided by the Mongol Empire. His stories, initially met with skepticism in Europe, offered a tantalizing glimpse into the sophisticated societies of the East. But it wasn't just European adventurers traveling east. Scholars, artists, engineers, and merchants moved in all directions, carrying not just goods, but ideas. Arabic mathematics, Persian astronomy, Chinese printing techniques, paper money, and even advanced medical knowledge flowed freely across the continent. Could we truly call this the world's first true globalization, albeit under duress? Perhaps the most impactful, and certainly the most dramatic example of this cross-cultural transfer was the spread of gunpowder technology. Originating in China, gunpowder was first widely used by the Mongols in their siege warfare. They deployed early cannons, bombs, and rockets against fortified cities, terrifying their enemies with these fire weapons. As their empire expanded, so did the knowledge of these devastating tools. The technology was transmitted westward, first to the Islamic world, where Mamluk and other engineers refined its composition and application, and then, inexorably, to Europe. By the 14th century, gunpowder cannons were beginning to appear on European battlefields, fundamentally altering the nature of warfare. This was not a slow evolution, but a revolution, ignited by the Mongol catalyst. Castles, once impregnable symbols of feudal power, suddenly became vulnerable. Did the Mongols, in their quest for conquest, inadvertently arm the very civilizations that would eventually dominate the globe? The Mongol Empire also disseminated administrative innovations that would echo for centuries. Their highly efficient postal system, the Yam, utilizing relay stations and riders across thousands of miles, allowed rapid communication across their vast domain. This was a blueprint for future communication networks, demonstrating the power of organized logistics. Their legal code, the Yasa, though often brutally enforced, sought to establish a universal law across diverse cultures, an ambitious undertaking that foreshadowed later attempts at international legal frameworks. Moreover, the Mongol practice of religious tolerance, a pragmatic decision to maintain order within a multicultural empire, was a radical concept for its time, challenging the ethnocentric and often religiously exclusive norms of many contemporary societies. How many of these modern concepts were first tested, albeit under harsh conditions, within the Mongol Imperium? However, to speak only of interconnectedness and innovation would be to ignore the monumental human cost. The Pax Mongolica was built on a foundation of unimaginable suffering and widespread destruction. Millions died during the initial conquests. Estimates range from 30 to 60 million, a catastrophic percentage of the world's population at the time. Entire cities were razed to the ground, cultures annihilated, and agricultural lands turned into desolation. The city of Baghdad, a jewel of Islamic civilization, was sacked in 1258, its libraries burned, its canals destroyed, marking a profound intellectual and cultural loss that reverberated for centuries. Can we ever truly balance such devastation against subsequent technological and cultural gains? And perhaps the most devastating unintended consequence of all, the accelerated spread of disease. The very same secure trade routes that facilitated the flow of goods and ideas also became superhighways for pathogens. The Black Death, which originated in Central Asia, was carried westward along the Silk Road, likely first by Mongol armies and then by merchants and travelers, unleashing a pandemic that decimated populations across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe in the mid-14th century. It's a chilling reminder that interconnectedness, while offering immense benefits, also carries profound risks. The Siege of Kaffa in 1346, where the Mongols reportedly catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the city walls, stands as one of history's earliest instances of biological warfare, a truly horrifying act. So, what then is the ultimate legacy of the Mongol war machine? It is a duality, stark and undeniable. On one hand, it represents an almost incomprehensible scale of destruction, a stark testament to the barbarity that human ambition can unleash. On the other, it inadvertently catalyzed a period of unprecedented global exchange, forcing disparate cultures to confront one another, leading to the rapid transfer of technologies, ideas, and even the seeds of a more interconnected world. The Mongols, in their ruthless pursuit of conquest, broke down old barriers and, in doing so, laid some of the accidental groundwork for what we might recognize as early globalization. Their military innovations offer enduring lessons. Adaptability, for they never clung rigidly to a single tactic but learned from every adversary and terrain. Discipline, for their forces moved as one, held together by an iron will and absolute loyalty to their command structure. And strategic foresight, for their campaigns were not mere raids but meticulously planned operations of unprecedented scale and ambition, often decades in the making. The Mongols remind us that true power lies not just in brute force, but in the intelligent application of resources, information, and an unwavering vision. As we look at the modern world, irrevocably shaped by global networks and technological diffusion, we must ask, how much of our present reality, both good and ill, echoes the thunderous hoofbeats of the Mongol war machine, a force that, through blood and iron, irrevocably changed the course of human history? From the desolate steppes to the gates of Vienna, the Mongol war machine wasn't just an army. It was a phenomenon, a chillingly effective system built on principles that transcend time. What ultimate lesson does their brutal genius offer us about power, innovation, and the true cost of conquest? We have journeyed through the dust and fury, witnessed the strategic brilliance and the horrifying efficiency that allowed a dispersed collection of nomadic tribes to forge the largest contiguous empire the world has ever known. They weren't just exceptional horsemen. They were meticulous planners, audacious innovators, and master manipulators of human psychology. But how did they consistently turn seemingly insurmountable odds into one-sided massacres? Think about their psychological warfare, the relentless terror that preceded their arrival. Cities would surrender at the mere rumor of a Mongol advance, saving themselves from the unspeakable alternative, only to find themselves under the iron fist of a new, distant lord. This wasn't random savagery. It was a calculated, deliberate policy. The Mongols understood something profound about fear, that it could be weaponized more effectively than any sword or arrow. Imagine the collective dread gripping an entire population as news spread of a city utterly annihilated, its inhabitants butchered, fields salted. Could your own walls withstand such a force, knowing what awaited defeat? This psychological impact often broke the enemy's will before the first arrow flew. Then there was their unparalleled mobility. The Mongol cavalry didn't merely ride into battle. They became a fluid, living organism, able to cover hundreds of miles in days, outflanking, outmaneuvering, and encircling armies many times their size. They redefined the concept of speed in warfare, rendering static defenses and traditional supply lines obsolete. They rode not just on horseback, but with horses, multiple mounts per warrior, allowing for continuous rapid advances without exhausting their mounts. Consider the logistical nightmare this would pose for any conventional army trying to pursue them. This wasn't merely fast travel. It was an extension of their tactical reach, allowing them to appear as if from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Their tactical deception was equally breathtaking. The Mongols perfected the art of the feigned retreat, the classic Mangadai maneuver, drawing enemies into a false sense of victory before turning to unleash a devastating volley of arrows or launching a renewed, ferocious assault. They would send small detachments to raid and harass, making enemies believe the main force was meager, only to reveal their true numbers in a crushing encirclement. How many seasoned commanders fell for this trap, convinced they had the upper hand, only to be swallowed whole? This wasn't luck. It was a deep understanding of human hubris and battlefield psychology. They didn't fight fair. They fought to win using every trick in the book. And let us not forget their adaptable engineering and logistics. Despite being steppe nomads, they mastered siege warfare with astonishing speed. They didn't just capture cities. They dismantled them. When faced with formidable fortifications, they employed Chinese engineers and Persian expertise, developing advanced trebuchets and catapults, even diverting rivers to flood besieged settlements. Who would have expected such sophisticated siegecraft from an army often perceived as barbarians? Their logistics, though lean, were incredibly efficient, utilizing fast-moving supply trains and living off the land when necessary, minimizing the vulnerabilities that plagued larger, slower armies. They didn't rely on existing knowledge. They assimilated and innovated without prejudice. The craziness of the Mongol war machine, then, wasn't born of chaos or mindless aggression. It was rooted in a profound, albeit brutal, understanding of human nature and military strategy. They grasped that warfare was as much about breaking the spirit as it was about breaking the body. They recognized the power of information asymmetry, consistently using scouts and spies to gather intelligence while concealing their own intentions. They didn't fight by the rules. They rewrote them. They faced enemies with superior numbers, entrenched positions, and often more advanced weaponry. Yet they consistently triumphed. Why? Because they operated on a different plane. While European knights charged with honor and Chinese dynasties relied on bureaucratic formations, the Mongols executed a cold, precise, and utterly ruthless form of total war. They embraced adaptability as their greatest weapon, evolving their tactics and integrating new technologies and personnel with astonishing speed. Could any contemporary power truly match this relentless, iterative improvement? The answer, repeatedly, was no. So what is the enduring relevance of their methods, not as something to emulate in our modern world, but as a stark and fascinating case study? The Mongol war machine forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about efficiency, innovation, and the nature of power. It demonstrates that the most effective strategies often emerge from a willingness to abandon convention, to embrace discomfort, and to relentlessly optimize for a singular objective: victory. They teach us that strategic thinking transcends specific technologies or cultural norms. The principles of speed, surprise, deception, concentration of force, and psychological manipulation are timeless. They are blueprints for overcoming numerical disadvantage, for achieving dominance through innovation rather than sheer mass. Is this not a lesson that resonates even in today's highly competitive, rapidly changing environments, be they military, economic, or technological? The ability to move fast, adapt quickly, and understand the psychology of your opponent remains a powerful differentiator. But their story also serves as a chilling reminder of the true cost of conquest. The genius of the Mongol war machine was inextricably linked to unimaginable destruction, vast human suffering, and the eradication of entire cultures. Their efficiency was ruthless, their innovation born of a drive for absolute power. We marvel at their strategic brilliance, yet we recoil from its consequences. Can true military genius ever be truly separated from the morality of its application? The Mongols force us to grapple with this fundamental dichotomy. They didn't just change battle tactics. They reshaped global history, stitching together distant lands and peoples, inadvertently catalyzing trade, cultural exchange, and even the spread of plagues across a newly interconnected world. Their impact reverberated for centuries, their name synonymous with both terror and unparalleled strategic mastery. Ultimately, the Mongol war machine stands as a monumental testament to what can be achieved when innovation, relentless execution, and a profound understanding of human nature converge. It is a testament to military genius, yes, but also a stark, unforgettable lesson in the brutal pragmatism of power. Their legacy challenges us to look beyond the immediate instruments of war and to consider the timeless principles that govern conflict itself, forever altering our perception of what an army could be. What truly defines an unstoppable force, even today, in a world utterly transformed from the one they conquered? The answers, perhaps, still lie in the dust clouds raised by their horses, whispering lessons of ruthless efficiency across the ages.